Before I begin the video, I just want to take a quick moment to say that I've always tried to be incredibly careful when I make these videos. These topics can be difficult to discuss, and it's really easy to upset people without even meaning to do so. I can't tell you how many videos I put on private or just never published because I questioned some aspect of that video. Which is why I've opened this channel to memberships where members would have access to all of those videos, numerous exclusive videos made just for channel members, along with early access and sneak peeks to my upcoming videos. However, if memberships aren't for you, you can always support this channel by leaving a tip in the tip jar by clicking on the thanks option, or just hitting the like button because it really does go a long way to help. I appreciate each and every one of you, so with that being said, grab a cup of coffee and let's get into the video, shall we? Kurt Cobain came out of the gray, rainy, oftentimes described miserable streets of Seattle, and depending on how old you are, it might be next to impossible to do it justice just how big Kurt and his band Nirvana really were in the 90s. When Nirvana rose to fame, Kurt found himself thrust into a world of adoration and total chaos, and he was completely removed from the life that he used to know. Kurt had spent years of his life with an undiagnosed stomach condition that was so bad it eventually led to him becoming addicted to heroin in an attempt to deal with the pain. And it was during that time, when Kurt was starting to spiral out of control, that Nirvana released their album Nevermind, which absolutely exploded. It was also around that same time that Kurt met and eventually married Courtney Love, who was the lead singer of the band Hole, which was also a very well-known band at the time. Courtney was a heroin addict too, and needless to say, that didn't make for a good pairing between the two. Kurt and Courtney went on to have a daughter, but their problems with heroin were so out of control that Kurt was eventually hospitalized, and that eventually led to him agreeing to go to rehab. However, after he was admitted to rehab, he promptly escaped and flew home. Ironically, it was on this flight that Kurt ran into none other than Duff McKagan, the guitarist for Guns N' Roses, which is an absolutely insane coincidence. But the two ended up talking, and little did Duff know it would be one of the last conversations Kurt had with anyone.
Off a tour, and I was flying from LA up to Seattle, to home. And I get on the plane, and Kurt gets on the plane and sits next to me. And we took off, and, he and I started talking. He had told me, he goes, I just took off from Exodus. We talked, we were drinking and...
I mean, did you talk about any of that heroin addiction on that plane journey with Kurt?
No, because we didn't want to, no way. It wasn't an addiction. On that plane ride. When you're drinking on a plane, you're not going to talk about addiction. We got to Seattle, we went to baggage claim, and he was pretty down. And a friend of mine, this guy Eddie, met me at baggage claim in Seattle. Kurt and Eddie went out to have a smoke, and my friend Eddie came back in. I said, hey man, maybe we should take him over to the house tonight, And we were drinking, so it wasn't a thing like I foresaw anything by any means. But he was down and he was on his own. So Eddie went back out to get Kurt, and right at that moment, his car had picked him up, and he was gone.
It was around this time that Courtney was told that Kurt had actually escaped from rehab and he was missing, to which she decided to hire a private investigator to find out where he was. And that's where things start to go off the rails, because the official narrative given by police was that an electrician installing a security system had discovered Kurt's body in a garden room above the garage of his house. However, it's believed that instead of calling the police, that electrician first called a radio show.
Rock band Nirvana is apparently he was a suicide at the age of 27. More now from NBC's Brian Williams.
Kurt Cobain's body was found inside a garage apartment adjacent to his Seattle home. Dead of an apparently self-inflicted shotgun wound, police say a suicide note was nearby. He was among the most powerful voices of his generation, an originator of a music style and fashion called grunge, as lead singer for the hugely successful rock group Nirvana, which has sold 15 million albums worldwide. Kurt Cobain's tenure as a living rock and roll icon was brief and troubled. Just last month, a combination of alcohol and drugs left him in a coma from which he fully recovered. Cobain and his wife, singer Courtney Love, appeared ready to resume life at home with their 2-year-old daughter.
After law enforcement arrived, they relatively quickly concluded that Kurt had killed himself. He had written a suicide note, apparently, and they believed that he had injected himself with a massive amount of heroin, then taken his own life with a 20-gauge shotgun. Courtney Love would actually go on to read Kurt's suicide note at a memorial where, at times, she would berate and curse him.
Anyway, He left a note. It's more like a letter to the editor. I don't know what happened. I mean, it was gonna happen. But it could have happened when he was 40. He always said he was gonna outlive everybody and be 120. I'm not gonna read you all the note because it's none of the rest of your business, but some of it is to you. I don't really think it takes away his dignity to read this, considering that it's addressed to most of you. He's such an asshole. I want you all to say asshole really loud.
It was ugly to watch, and I guess that should have been the end of this story. It was tragic and sad, but it's not the end. In fact, that's where things actually get started. So let's start from the top. Apparently, after Kurt's autopsy, it was discovered that Kurt had over 3 times the lethal limit of heroin in his system, which some experts claim would have made it physically impossible for him to basically do anything, let alone shoot himself. Kurt was found wearing shoes, which would have made killing himself with a shotgun extremely difficult, which only becomes weirder when you consider the fact that absolutely no fingerprints were found on that shotgun. Kurt's supposed suicide note read much more like a letter to his band explaining that he no longer wanted to play music. Only the last few lines of that note discuss suicide, and some experts have claimed that those lines were written with a different pen and had different handwriting. And to make things even weirder, someone had apparently used Kurt's credit card after law enforcement believed he was dead, and that card has never been recovered. The private investigator originally hired by Courtney Love believed that Courtney Love had actually paid a local heroin junkie named Duce to kill Kurt, because Kurt had actually been planning to divorce her, and due to a prenup, she would have been left with nothing. That investigator has maintained this entire time that Courtney Love lied to him numerous times and was suggesting Kurt killed himself before his body had even been found. And if you're still not convinced, here's an actual video of none other than the infamous Duce telling a reporter that he was offered $50,000 to kill Kurt by Courtney, which he refused, and instead he set up Courtney with a man named Alan Wrench, who took the offer and killed Kurt.
We're talking about Courtney Love contacted you to kill Kurt Cobain.
Yeah. See, I was hanging out in the rock shop. A shop in Hollywood. And see, her old drummer used to go out with Sticky from Hole. And that's how I met her. Because she used to buy heroin off my roommate. And, you know, we did have like backyard parties and stuff in Anaheim or Fuller. She was always hanging out. And then I hadn't seen her or talked to her for years. Because I always thought she was kind of skanky. And,
Courtney Love.
Yeah. And then finally, I'm standing out in front of the rock shop.
Oh yeah.
Nirvana were playing in town that same night. Duce. Hey, I got a job for you.
Keep on talking, I can hear you.
I'll pay you $50,000 to whack my old man. I want you to blow his fucking head off. And I go, what? She goes, I'll pay you $50,000 if you can kill Cobain by blowing his head off. She goes, I'll keep in contact with you, and it'll be in about a month or two.
For what?
And I said, okay. And then she split. And I thought she was kidding, you know. And then she calls up looking for me, but we had already gone on tour. And then we were on the road, and Kurt was shot.
We're not anymore.
You know, and I go, wait a minute. Well, I get back to LA because my buddy that works at the shop overheard her talking to me. And I get back and I had that trip. Offered me to kill Kurt Cobain, and just 2 months after she offers me to do it, head blown off. And I go, I bet you she got one of her towing boys to do it.
So, that's a lot to take in, and I think everything I mentioned here is worth discussing. However, if we're going to be honest to the topic in memory of Kurt Cobain, I think it's important to mention that the available, overwhelming evidence strongly supports Kurt having committed suicide. I always try to present both sides of an argument, and don't get me wrong, I think that there's a valid conversation to be had here about Kurt's death. But if I'm being honest, I think a much more valid conversation would be about mental health and how a man who was clearly going off the rails was so terribly abandoned by the people who should have loved him the most. Because at one time, Kurt Cobain was one of the most beloved musicians in the world, while simultaneously being one of the loneliest people on earth. Everybody loved him and cheered while he was basically screaming from the rooftops that something was wrong. And if you're still totally convinced that Kurt was murdered and it wasn't a suicide, and I can get how someone could come to a conclusion like that, but regardless of whatever it is you think, you still have to find a way to explain pictures like this. This is a real picture taken of Kurt Cobain right before his death, and if this isn't a warning sign, I don't know what is. I almost never look down on people who lean towards conspiracies because if I've learned anything covering true crime, it's that conspiracies usually exist because deep down inside most of us, we can't help but feel like evil things shouldn't be allowed to have simple explanations. So yeah, maybe Kurt Cobain was murdered. Maybe one of the greatest music icons in history had his life stolen from him. Or maybe, and sadly much more likely, one of the greatest musicians who ever lived threw away everything he had to offer the world because he didn't think he deserved it. Ironically, Kurt Cobain didn't owe us anything. And regardless of what you believe may have happened to him, it's so deeply sad that he thought he did. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching.